Welcome everyone to our latest episode of Infrastructure Insights. Delighted to say we've got a really special guest joining us, Neil Morrison, who is the Group HR and Communications Director for FTSE 100 water company Severn Trent. He's regularly listed as one of the most influential people in HR by well-renowned HR publications, and he's also a regular commentator on leadership and management. I had the pleasure of meeting Neil for the first time at the Skills Summit hosted by Water UK at Westminster earlier in the summer. So, Neil, is there anything further you would like to sort of elaborate on that introduction?
That's it's terrible, isn't it? Most influential HR person. I always say it's like the prize turnip at the fair, that kind of award. It's I mean, I guess, look, I've worked in HR pretty much all my life, and I've been in the sector now, in the water sector, for the last 8 years. But before that, I spent a good 8, 9 years in publishing. So trade publishing, merging Penguin and Random House across the world and doing all sorts of fun, glamorous things in the world of hallowed world of publishing. And before that, sort of 8, 9 years at Argos, maybe a bit less glamorous, if I'm totally honest, but equally exciting. Doing the first bricks and mortar retailer. So obviously the internet now is a thing that we don't even think twice about when we shop online. But we were the first people to put in that kind of integrated between picking up in store and being able to deliver online. So yeah, a through and through HR person, but with a fair smattering of comms during that period of time as well.
Right, yeah, and it's interesting that you've got kind of comms under your wing as well, and perhaps we'll be able to get into that a bit later. But look, if we just sort of look at you're a people leader for a FTSE 100, FTSE 50 company, but based outside of London in the southeast, in a sector, water sector, facing sort of huge change. Over the next kind of 3 to 5 years, what are your kind of top people priorities, and I guess how do you decide where to put your energy on those priorities?
Yeah, I mean, your point about it being footsie outside of London is actually one of the reasons that I wanted to come to Severn Trent, because I think, there's huge amounts of opportunity for businesses based outside of London and the South East to really impact their communities and local economies. And that's really one of the big challenges I think we've got over the next few years. So the AMP8 investment programme obviously sees billions of pounds coming to the Midlands, to the centre of the country. And so how do we use that investment in order to drive really good quality jobs, not only directly with us in Severn Trent, but also through the supply chain, and make sure that we're giving those opportunities to people who also will be customers of ours, or live next door to our employees, or be part of their villages or towns or cities. And so one of the big challenges is really, how do you do that? How do you use that investment, not only to make sure that you've got the skills that you need in order to deliver that program, but also how do you do it in order to create opportunity within the region and make sure that those kind of investment programs really deliver beyond the infrastructure, but actually deliver in terms of social value and in terms of economic growth and community cohesion in the regions that we're operating in. And I think, one of the things that probably isn't known about water companies, or isn't perhaps noted about water companies, is that because of our regional structure like that, we have great opportunity to do things in communities that maybe it's harder for other organizations to do if you're, more dispersed around the country with a headquarter in London and maybe operations outside, whereas pretty much everything that Severn Trent does is on our patch, and so it has an impact on those communities.
Fantastic. So, and that sounded like it was one of the reasons which attracted you to the organization in the first place. It's interesting that, isn't it, around the sort of opportunity in the region, the social value, and anything which you've sort of seen during your time there in keeping with those themes as a sort of tangible example that you might be able to share.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at, we just had GCSE results this
Mm.
week, yesterday, in fact, and one of the themes that came out of that was the underperformance of white working class students. compared to similarly sort of economic banded young people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And so there's a real kind of question around what is going on there. And when we talk about social mobility, we talk about socioeconomic diversity, that plays into some of these kind of challenges. So how do you give good quality jobs to traditional white working class backgrounds where maybe the industries that they used to work in or the families generationally used to work in, mining, manufacturing, car manufacturing, if you look across West Midlands, have been eroded over time.
Mm.
How do you give really great opportunity to those communities and to give them opportunity to deliver economic growth in their towns and villages? And we're really proud that over the last few years, we've always been in the top 10 of the Social Mobility Index, up there punching well above our weight for a utility
Mm.
because of the work we do exactly in that space. So it's taking the investment that we've got and being able to target that to really good quality jobs in areas where, if it wasn't for us, maybe there wouldn't be that many other jobs because of infrastructure, in terms of transport, in terms of education, whatever that may be. So that's one example of where you can really use the power of investment to drive opportunity in communities.
Very interesting. And just sort of back to that theme of water. I suppose it was one of the kind of key themes at the conference that we both attended in terms of attracting people to the water sector, particularly younger generations. It's not easy, especially when water might be up against other kind of industries. And from what I understand, since you've joined the organization, was it back in 2017, 2018? It was
Yep.
roughly headcount of 5,000 at that point and on target to reach 10,000 by next year, if that's
I think we've
about
already tipped that number. I
right.
think we'll be about 10,500. Yeah.
With everything that we've got in mind there around that sort of attraction of talent and how certain, shall we say, age demographics, there's some sort of gaps there in terms of
Mm.
the water industry. But how are you sort of tackling that challenge at Severn Trent? And I suppose what's been working well for you so far?
Yeah, so we're big advocates of apprenticeships. We have the Severn Trent Academy, which is a purpose-built education unit, and we're now a apprenticeship provider. So we not only recruit, but we also train ourselves. And so my trainers are have been on the tools themselves. They're ex Severn Trent. Well, they are Severn Trenters, but they're ex operatives who are coming in and now training the future generation. And apprenticeships are a brilliant way of bringing in younger people into the industry, and not just younger people, career changers as well. But
Hmm.
but it's one brilliant way for young people to come in and learn from people around them who are more experienced and work with them, and then provide a little bit of succession planning, as kind of how many people are going to be retiring over a period of time, what your attrition rate is. You then kind of know how many apprenticeships you need to be bringing in at what point in time
Mm.
so that they're competent and qualified at the point in which they need to do the role properly. And the great thing about it is one, younger people get to learn from more experienced people. Two, the more experienced people get to cascade their knowledge and experience before they maybe retire or before they move on. And so there's a real sense of, this is my apprentice and I'm going to teach them the right way of doing things and I'm going to pass that on. And so that's a fantastic way of bringing people in. I think, on top of that, it's also making sure that we're more attractive to younger people for kind of areas such as data or cybersecurity, for example, where you might not necessarily think of a water company as the first place you'd want to go for doing those things. But if I give you one example, we had a data apprenticeship recently. We had over 1,500 applications for one role. So there's
Wow.
a real appetite for younger people to come into the industry. I think because they see the investment, because they
Mm.
see the future stability. And, if you like Severn Trent, you've got a reputation for having a really good culture and a really good kind of leadership and management and a level of security there. I think that permutates through communities and people kind of say, well, if you want a good job regionally and locally, Severn Trent's one of the big employers you might want to look at. And so, keeping working on all of those things is super important.
That's very interesting, particularly that point about apprenticeships and thinking about kind of more experienced professionals who may already be at kind of operating at C-suite level or wanting to be over the next sort of five years or so. And this is very much the sort of demographic within critical infrastructure that we at Newsom would deal with. What would be your sense of or even your kind of advice to those sorts of people who might be listening in terms of what do they need to be focusing on in order to get to where they want to be?
So I suppose there's two things, aren't there? There's kind of sort of technical skills, and then there's kind of leadership skills and behaviors. And one of the ironic things about getting more senior is you probably do less technical stuff and you become more of a generalist sort of business leader. And I think one of the things we see, particularly from deep technical backgrounds, engineers, operations, for example, is people come up through their swim lane and they progress because they're really good at what they do and they get bigger and better. And then that tipping point to senior management team or into C-suite means that you've got to be able to play across the swim lanes rather than just in your own. And so I think things people can be doing in that space in terms of preparation is really thinking about how do you get knowledge and experience outside of your own area? How do you demonstrate an interest if you're in investor relations, in financing, in people management, in assurance and the general counsel functions, or
Mm,
in customer if you're an engineer. What are the customer metrics that are being looked at? So really trying to broaden out, not by necessarily moving into roles, but just getting that experience as you go and asking questions and being curious and trying to show that breadth, because that's what you're going to be asked to do when you're sat around the exec table or in the board table. You're going to be asked to be a generalist as much as a specialist. And then the second point in terms of leadership is just, I always talk about leadership as a continuous kind of practice. It's not something that you ever perfect or get to a point where you are the perfect leader. So we will all make mistakes on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And so what's your reflection on that? How do you remain curious about kind of, that conversation went really badly, or I was doing that presentation and I could have done this, or I could have done that, and that's how I'll improve on that. Or, I had this situation with this employee or this team, and what are the things that I would have done differently in the future? And I think that kind of reflective sense of continuous improvement is really, really important, because nobody has ever the finished article. And one of the big red flags for me whenever I'm hiring at that level is when people come in and say I'm ready,
mm.
because how do you know you're ready until you're actually doing it? And I can guarantee most people won't be, and that's okay, because that's the stretch you get from promotion. You should be ready for that stretch. So I think those two pieces are probably my key advice.
Excellent, excellent. So that piece around people will have kind of been working their way up, swimming in a lane. The more senior you get, approaching C-suite, it's a case, well, how can we look for knowledge and experience in a host of other areas where ultimately will be on your watch and you'll be expected to be all over that detail. Leadership being a kind of constantly evolving, never-ending kind of continuum, and that sort of encouragement of reflection, emotional intelligence, equally as important. So, thank you very much for that. Just sort of flipping that back to the data point you mentioned, because I think it's really interesting, particularly about Severn Trent. So we've seen a lot of headlines about financial pressures in the water sector. That's been sort of well documented. However, and we're not here to talk about the financial situation of all water companies, but Severn Trent is often held up as a leader in using data to make smarter spending decisions. Could you maybe share a couple of examples where this approach has made a real difference?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I'd say, just in context, before I give a couple of examples, and probably to buy myself some time to think about them, is I think there's something about where data comes together with, whether it's engineering or operations or delivery, So that sweet spot is kind of the Venn diagram, if you like, of all the areas, and where they overlap is the real important part. And we talk a lot about data, but on its own, it's kind of useless. It needs to be informing and informed in both directions. And I guess, two examples. One example around smart metering, for example. So, we've got a big program over the next 5 years in terms of installing smart metering. People will be familiar with that from the energy sector, maybe a bit less familiar from that in the water sector, but lots of water companies have got really big programs over the next 5 years to install them. Um, and that ambition means you need to think slightly differently about how you do it. So, our engineering teams, along with our metering teams, along with our data teams, have looked at, what is the size of the challenge? What's the scope? What's the kind of configuration that we need? And have been able to take that away and look at what we'd call a plug and play option. So kind of manufacturer ready for installation, single use, or single format, sorry, not single use, kind of installation. And that piece of work has meant that we're really confident we'll be able to deliver the scale, the pace, at a cost point or a price point that is really cost effective, delivering better outcomes for customers and for the metering teams, but actually driven by a collaboration of looking at the data, looking at the engineering opportunities, and looking at the delivery, and how do you bring those three kind of together. The other example would probably be the spills program, and obviously, spills or sewage spills or CSO operations, depending on how knowledgeable you are of the sector, is one of the like totemic issues at the moment. And we've got an enormous program that we've been working on over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, to deliver a whole load of interventions across the network in order to reduce the number of times that sewage outlets activate. And of course, what you don't want to do is spend a load of money putting in a load of interventions that actually aren't going to change anything, because the hydraulics of the location that you've put them in, or the specific operation of the works doesn't fit. And so, the data teams working with the engineering teams again and the operational teams have been able to take all of this data together and to look at how do you model the best, most cost effective, but also operationally effective operations across the network at pace and at scale, so that you can start to give the environmental improvement and the subsequent reputational improvement that customers and stakeholders are looking for. So, it's two examples, but again, I'd come back to it's using data as part of a broader, kind of framework of problem solving, and using it in a smart way to make sure that everybody's engaged in the outcome.
Kind of water related question. Um, it's I think just in terms of also where we're at with this AMP cycle, obviously it's the biggest investment program that the sector's ever seen, and capital is going to be critical. How do you think water companies can compete for larger pools of private investment over the next decade, 15 years? And if you were going to be speaking directly to, say, infrastructure investors who are following this closely and thinking about making decisions, maybe not imminently, but perhaps in the future, what would your pitch be?
Yeah, so I think the obvious thing is to look to the Cunliffe review, which was published, a few weeks, months ago. And so, Sir John Cunliffe has done a really comprehensive review of the sector, has made a whole series of recommendations, and the government is now going to go away and look at those and come back with their recommendations on the back of it. And I guess there's kind of four key takeaways that we'd give to the Cunliffe review. So the first one is that it really strengthens the case for long-term growth.
Mm.
And so the investment and the returns that are associated with that. Um, it makes commitments to a fair risk and reward framework. So the commitment to fair reward, again, I think is really important. And the ability alongside that for outperformance still remains. And Severn Trent has been, has a track record of outperformance. And so particularly in our case, that's really important. They talk a lot in the review about this supervisory and regional framework. And so I think there's opportunity there for company specific outcomes, which again, favour maybe some of the stronger performers within the sector. And again, the fourth point is that there are positive changes potentially to the regulatory framework that come from that, depending on what government implement from the Cunliffe review. So, as a major review of the sector, probably the biggest since privatisation, I think it's been trailed as. There's actually lots of positive messages in there for investors to take away. And I think that stability that potentially comes off the back of this for the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades makes it a really attractive sector.
And Neil, and just as I was listening to you there, I was thinking back to, say, for instance, sectors that you've worked in previously. I am actually going to ask you for sort of future predictions around sort of HR and leadership and things. But as a maybe a bridge back to before you joined the water sector, have you seen any? I don't know. Are there any sort of similarities that you've seen in? It doesn't matter whether it's water or publishing or Argos. Are there any kind of common threads that you've seen in your time in senior leadership roles, or has water utilities, has it just been a completely new experience for you?
I mean, I think if you talk about people to start with, actually, it's different shades of the same color in terms of people and leadership and delivery. So, it's how do you get people to come together to perform to the best of their ability to deliver the outcomes that the organization needs to do. And I think there's a lot of similarity at a distance to organizations on all of that. Obviously, the types of people, the types of work, and the types of things that need to be doing are different. And to a certain extent, there's probably more similarity between retail to a certain extent and utilities than there is maybe with publishing. But ultimately, at the end of the day, as I say, what we're trying to do is organise people to deliver outcomes, and that's kind of similar. I think, what is different is, in water, we obviously deal in 5-year, 10-year, 50-year timeframes, which means that you're working from what's happening in the next hour, the next day, the next week, but also up to what's happening in 50 years' time in terms of water resources and what will that look like. Whereas in retail, you are a bit more hand to mouth. It is, what's happening this hour, what are your daily sales like? What are your weekly sales like? What do you need to do in order to kind of react to that? And publishing is somewhere probably a little bit in between the two. So I think what is different is that time frame that you look at things at. But ultimately, people are the same wherever they work. They want to come to work, do a good job, feel recognised for doing a good job, go home at the end of the day feeling safe and secure on the back of it, and feeling fairly rewarded for the work they've done. So, it's just how you change the shades of colouring. It's not necessarily the colour of it itself that's different.
Yeah, very, very interesting, very interesting. And just looking ahead with those kind of medium and long term horizons, maybe say, let's say we're at the end of this AMP cycle, what would be kind of positive outcomes that you're kind of working towards at Severn Trent?
Yeah, so I think we need to move the reputation of the sector on. I think definitely over this AMP, and so what does that look like? That looks like delivering on your commitments. So where you say you're going to invest, 15 billion pounds, you deliver 15 billion pounds, and you give customers the outcome for that, and that's super important. I think it's about keeping bills affordable, um, and making sure that customers understand and value the bill, and they understand what they're getting for it in return, not necessarily just in the service today, but in terms of intergenerational fairness.
Mm,
Um, it's about looking ahead to the environmental impact, and understanding what more we can do to deliver services and to deliver them brilliantly, but also in an environmentally friendly way.
mhm,
And I guess it's also about thinking about the impact in terms of communities as well, and making sure that both our employees, our customers, and our stakeholders in the communities all feel that they've got a buy-in to everything that's been delivered, and they understand what we've done and why we've done it, and they understand what the next 5 years is going to look like on the back of that.
mm. And that links to the social value piece, which you mentioned earlier on. So it's a real opportunities there. I definitely want to ask you for the time that we've got left around just kind of broader people HR themes, if you like. So,
Mm.
and I've sort of got prior experience of working in a FTSE 100 in a different sector, but the themes of world of work, skills based shortage, DEI, all these kind of hot topics will be on the agenda of people like yourself, senior leaders within large companies. What rather than get into the nuts and bolts of each, where do you see as the sort of largest, the biggest challenges for HR leaders of large organizations in any sector, say in the lead up to 2030 and then beyond?
Yeah. So I think they all boil down to fairness, bizarrely. So if you look about AI, you've got a choice as an organization about how you implement new technologies, and the impact that they have on your workforce. And so the key question there is, what's a fair deal for different stakeholders as we look at implementing this? Um, if you look at EDI, ultimately, forget the EDI moniker. It comes down to fairness. It's about how do you create as level and fair a playing field as possible in what you do. And I think, one of the things that when we talk about the future of work, quite often we get into technology and we get into all sorts of things like that because it feels exciting and it feels really, engaging and interesting. And people say, young people have got an expectation of X, Y, and Z. But actually, one of the things that I think is happening is quite a large level of polarization going on outside of companies. And I think business has a real opportunity to be a cohesive force in society in terms of driving fairness and fair outcomes and creating a place of safety. And so, the things that you list and you talk about all come together a little bit in terms of what is business's opportunity to be a force for good for its employees and its stakeholders and communities? What is it that we could be doing to drive good outcomes? Now, that doesn't mean that you won't be making tough decisions, and it doesn't mean that sometimes things have to happen that have negative consequences. I don't think it should be used as a kind of catch-all to say, it's all rainbows and unicorns and positive stuff. What I'm talking about is every decision you can go through a lens that says, how do we create a fairer future through the decisions that we're making today? And so, you know, to give you an example at the far end of it, mass fire and rehire, ultimately everybody knows that that's not a fair way of behaving, right? But it's a choice that you can make. And so I think, in a world where it is increasingly polarized and where there is increasing tensions outside of work, I think the real challenge is how do we create stability and safety within work through really fair, really supportive, but really high performing organizations where people go home and they feel really satisfied because they've been recognized, they've delivered to the best of their ability, and they feel fairly rewarded.
Very interesting perspective, Neil. Thank you for that. And it's yeah, it's a topic I'm sure we could both discuss for a lot more time. But
Yeah.
just to kind of sort of close things off, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. And like I mentioned, so many more questions that I could have asked you. But on a personal note, what's the best bit of career advice you've had, or the one that you find yourself passing on most often? We like to ask all our guests this one.
Yeah. So I'll go back to Tom Weldon, who was my CEO at Penguin Random House. I mean, Liv Garfield will now kill me for not quoting her on one of her many bits of advice to me. But Tom said to me, there are two types of successful people. Um, there are those that get up in the morning and think that they're going to be successful just on the pure fact that they're awake. And there are those people who wake up every morning and think, today is the day that I'm going to be found out. And that drives them to success. And I guess as someone who has always woken up in that second camp of thinking, oh my God, I've got to, prove myself today, just actually recognizing that there were other people out there, that not everybody who was successful was there, super confident, super strong, always thinking about the next thing, that there were lots of people who were kind of managing, anxiety, imposter syndrome, self-doubt on a daily basis and still succeeding was really quite helpful because it probably allowed me to come to terms with it, be at peace with
Mm.
it a little bit and kick on. So that's the bit of advice I share with a lot of people over the years. It's just, if you're feeling those things, that doesn't mean that you can't be successful. In fact, you can use it to drive your success if if you engage with it and you embrace it rather than let it be a kind of negative driver on your outlook.
Well, what a wonderful note to end things there. So thank you very much for that, Neil. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. And yeah, I'm sure we'll catch up soon.
Thank you very much.